today. So this title that I've given the speech, the talk here today, The Universality of the Figure, its central importance in Catholic art, and its decline in the 20th century sort of alludes to some of those ideas, and we'll try to answer a few questions regarding figurative art in general. But first I wanted to use this, this quote by St. Pope John Paul II, because we're dealing with art about persons. The person is an entity of the sort to which the only proper and adequate way to relate is love. So this idea that there's a value of personhood that demands of us a certain response, and that response is to love the person. And I'm hoping that this quote can sort of illuminate our journey through art history and some of the cultural events that took place in the 20th century, and light the way for a future that is being written as we speak. So we can take as one premise of this talk the idea that the 20th century has largely rejected the figure. We'll see examples of this later on in the talk, and try to answer the questions: why had the figure been so prevalent in art throughout the ages in the first place? Why had the figure been so prevalent in Catholic art in particular? And we'll talk about one of the many reasons that figuration suffered a decline in the 20th century. There are many reasons for it. You'll learn in art history books about how this and that and the other movement in art sort of influenced the trajectory of art. But I want to talk about a philosophical reason that is mentioned in one of C.S. Lewis's books, The Abolition of Man, as our sort of guide for our analysis. And then ultimately answer the question, why should we even care about figurative art, or why should we make figurative art? Maybe some of these other modes of art making are equally as good and valid, and if that's what we like, that's what we should have. So I'm going to try to make the case for figurative art in the face of all these other movements as well. So we'll start at the very beginning, some of the most ancient works of art that are known. Like this Venus of Willendorf found in Austria. It's deemed to be tens of thousands of years old. Figurative works like this are seen around the globe throughout the ages. So just a short array of images that can walk us through sort of this global context that I was talking about a minute ago. Whether these are figurines like this from Central America, or larger scale monumental works directly into the wall of a cliff like this in China, or works that we're familiar with from the Pacific Northwest, from different cultures, whether it's bronze casting that was developed by many cultures throughout to make more permanent works, little figurines from various African cultures, giant monumental works still being made here in the United States and in the 20th century, whether it's folk art or works of art by huge civilizations that were extremely influential in their time and beyond their time. Figurative art seems to be everywhere, even in the furthest most reaches of the globe. Easter Island heads here come to mind. So art is universal to all cultures. We can say that figurative art is also universal to all cultures, with few exceptions where it was, say, prohibited by law. Judaism isn't famous for its figurative art, but even there are pockets in which, in illuminated manuscripts and things like this, you'll find figuration in spite of a prohibition. So the figurative art is, at least in its propensity or inclination, universal, and in the vast majority of cultures actually found as well. So these are two premises. So it seems awfully bizarre within this context that there would be a conspicuous lack of figuration in 20th century art, as we'll discuss here in a minute. A few ideas about art from various times. This here is another one of these ancient figurines. It's the Lion Man. It was found in Germany. It's also deemed to be tens of thousands of years old. And this work of art is telling us something about man. It's telling us something about animals as well. It's an anthropomorphized lion. It's an upright standing lion. And what this artist is trying to tell us exactly, we don't know, but he's certainly drawing a parallel between animal and man. So there's something of man and animal, or something of animal and man, or perhaps it's anthropomorphized for the sake of representing a deity, we don't know. But there's a kinship between man and animal, man belonging to the animal kingdom. But Rodin tells us, perhaps thinking of Aristotle, that man is a rational animal. The Greeks say man is actually like the gods. He has divine proportions within the human body that reveal the mind of the gods in creation, and he is akin to them and is elevated above the natural sphere. Man is the center of the cosmos, says Da Vinci, along with all the other great humanists of the Renaissance, in a long-standing tradition that dates back 2,500 years, thinking of Protagoras, this idea that man is the measure of all things. Man is in the image and likeness of God, says Michelangelo, and he has one part of him, the head, which is somehow celestial. Its backdrop is the sky there. It's the point of man, which is akin to God. And he also has this other element of him that is terrestrial, the body that is made of the earth and returns to the earth. And there's a struggle, he tells us, between this celestial aspect of man and this terrestrial aspect of man. So in many of these works of art, you can see that there's a philosophical inclination behind them. And this is true of other cultures as well. We're starting to narrow our focus a little bit, in particular on Western culture. But we can see in many of these artworks that there's an intellectual pursuit to know the nature of man, and that is being expressed in art to do with the figure. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about C.S. Lewis and in his book, The Abolition of Man, which has as its subtitle, How Education Develops Man's Sense of Morality. So in a sense, this book is about education. It's also about morality and less so about art. But I think that there's a strong parallel between some of the ideas in it and what we're going to be talking about in here. So I wanted to start with this idea that the world of proper value responses that he terms the Tao is set in his book in stark contrast to the world of the Green Book, which needs a little bit further explanation. The Green Book essentially is a textbook for school children in which value relativism is being espoused. In essence, the idea that when we are encountering something, say, beautiful, that the quality of beauty is not in the thing in and of itself, but rather in the beholder's response to it. So the object itself doesn't have any kind of objective characteristic that demand a certain response to us. Whereas C.S. Lewis says that that is not true, that things are values in and of themselves that do demand a certain response to us, and that response varies, of course, from thing to thing. And he claims that the educational problem is to train the pupil those responses which are in themselves appropriate, so to abhor that which is abhorrent and to be drawn to that which is attractive, to find beautiful that which is beautiful, and to act in accordance to a certain morality that treats for example, persons with dignity and so on and so forth. And in making these proper responses to the values that demand those responses of us, therein consists the very nature of man, he says. So this is an important idea when we're looking at art as well, that also demands a certain response from us, but also contains values inherently within it. So we can add to our list of things that we're sort of accumulating here the idea that art is a response to the world of values. People make art about people because they are responding to the value of personhood, which we saw from John Paul II is a value that requires of us the response of love, as we were talking about. So of B, we can say this value response to personhood, that is love, is also contained within figurative art throughout. And you can see the various parts of man starting to emerge here, that these various aspects of art appeal to and come from. The intellect is accessed, if you will, or engaged with this philosophical pursuit. The heart is engaged in this value response to personhood, and those are also its sources. Dietrich von Hildebrand says of the heart that in many ways it is more the real self of the person than his intellect or will. So it's placed very, very high in this hierarchical structure of man. I want to take a brief detour through architecture here to flesh out another point. Much of our terminology in architecture is derived from the body. We see here the facade of a building, right, is its face. The windows are its eyes. From within them, we can look out to the world outside, and so on. But some buildings have actual eyes as well, termed eyes, the oculus, from the Latin word for eye. In this building here, the Pantheon in Rome, this is representing the eye of God. Many measurements throughout and proportions throughout buildings are derived from the body. So you see it here in this beautiful Renaissance drawing by Francesco di Giorgio. All the proportions of the molding derive from the various parts of the head and neck and chest and so on. And it's by no coincidence that this aspect right here is running right through the mouth there, because it is called dental molding. So buildings have teeth as well. Michelangelo says of this, it is therefore indisputable that the limbs of architecture are derived from the limbs of man. And we'll see some images of this as well. And he who does not master the nude cannot understand the principles of architecture. So even Michelangelo himself, the foremost figurative artist of all times, and one of the greatest architects of all time, sees architecture itself as a figurative art. And we see buildings adorned with figures in every element, in the columns and the corbels and these elements that uphold the structure of the building and adorn the building as well. There's another way in which buildings are somehow akin to people. This idea of the temple being something that can house the spirit. The Greek temple of Athena here at the Parthenon, housing within it, this is a reproduction of it, but once was this gigantic sculpture of Athena herself. On her birthday, the doors were flung open, and the temple was so aligned that the rising sun would come right spilling through these front doors and illuminate this glorious gilded sculpture, right? This fiery, luminous personage within the stone temple. This idea that the spirit, the life force, is dwelling within the temple of stone. And we have this, of course, this idea that the body is the temple in our own faith tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition. Here, two examples, 1 Corinthians 6:19. Do you know that your bodies are a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? And then, of course, in John 2:19, Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and 3 days later I will raise it up. And a couple lines later, it's sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. In case you didn't get that, he's talking about the temple of his body. So there's this idea of a kinship between a body and temple within our own culture as well. And here, many images of this, right? The floor plan of many churches designed after the body. The elevation here, again, back to this idea of Michelangelo, the limbs of man, showing the proportions of the limbs of the architecture. And these cruciform footprints that we have are indeed the shape of a body. They are the nave, the main body of the church, as we call it, houses the faithful who are members of the mystical body of Christ. And at the head of this mystical body of Christ is Christ himself. Up here at the apse, that's where the altar is, that's where the tabernacle is, that's where Christ himself resides within the church. So there's a whole another layer of meaning there with this faith community that is drawn together through the Eucharist, participating bodily and spiritually in communion with God. And that spills over almost indistinguishably between the people that make up the church and the church as the building, and back and forth. The images sort of converge and overlap there. And of course, those who make up this temple, the living stones, the pillars of the church, the saints, here an example of that built into the architecture as well. And of course, our churches are filled with figurative art that speaks of these mysteries. Here, Raphael's painting. Here, a cathedral in Wheeling, so all the way through into the 20th century, this is being done. Another great church in Rome, St. Peter and Paul outside the wall. So in the classical tradition, architecture, and in particular church or temple architecture, are figurative art forms in and of themselves, and they're also, of course, adorned with figures in every artistic medium: stained glass, sculpture, painting, mosaic, etc. So we can add to our list of reasons for the centrality of the figure in art this theological notion, all this bodily language of the incarnation in Catholic theology, the idea that art itself is a physical thing that represents an idea, a spiritual idea, and these notions, not in particular this notion of the mystical body, but the notion that art and the figure is used to depict spiritual realities is also universal to all these cultures that we were talking about earlier. So one of the ideas that's being talked about here in the abolition of man is this notion that through education we're actually passing down from one generation to the next what it means to be human, right? These proper value responses that C.S. Lewis said make up the very nature of man are being handed down from one generation to the next. And the notion that tradition, as Mahler said, is not the worship of ashes, but rather the preservation of fire, that the torch is being passed on. We can say that also about art, that figurative art preserves a certain idea of man and passes that idea on for us all to live up to from one generation to the next. So now we come to the part where he talks about the abolition of man and what this actually means. And he offers this idea that as man becomes more and more technologically advanced and more scientifically knowledgeable, that the conquest of nature becomes something more and more interesting to him. And in some respects, the idea of understanding deeply nature for our own benefit, the fact that we can take penicillin and be well, this is a good thing. The fact that we can farm and cross-pollinate things and create wonderful, organized ways of producing our own livelihood and so on, our own food and so on and so forth. These are great things, but there's also aspects in which man then starts to take these things too far. And in his attempts to conquer nature and dominate nature, he fails to understand that the world is made up of values that are in and of themselves intrinsically of a certain value, and that they demand these proper responses that we were talking about. And instead he attempts to assert his own will and make them into something that they are not already. And ends up in an attempt to dictate or author or engineer nature. And ultimately, in its final stages, this conquest of nature turns on man himself, and he no longer believes that he himself is one of these objective values, but rather that he can wholly determine what he is, and in that act, man, as we knew him, is abolished, is vanquished. So it's a tragic idea, and I think one that if we think about it a little bit, can see this is the time that he correctly recognized we are living in right now, and the trajectory we are on right now, and we'll see some examples of this. So in art, the way this applies is all the way through the late 1800s. Works like this by Courbet, or if you think of all the early modernists, really the impressionist artists and post-impressionist artists, all were still working within a figurative tradition, but increasingly more and more so, it moved away from any type of representation, any type of figuration, any type of anything intelligible into things like this, right? Jackson Pollock, who is scribbling forth these dribbles and of these types of paintings, says he actually wants to eliminate in the viewer any search for meaning. In fact, he's saying these paintings are about nothing at all, and just revel in the nature of painting, right? Works like this by Kandinsky, all the big art names of the 20th century. This is a drawing, supposedly blue tape on a gallery wall. Jasper Johns, The White Target. Mark Rothko, This one, you can't see. There's actually two different shades of red in here that you can't make out. So I apologize for the bad slide. This is not a misslide. This is actually a work of art. Here it is on the wall. And here is Ad Reinhardt himself pondering his masterpieces in his studio. In sculpture, you see things like this. Chamberlain's auto parts crunched together into a hideous amalgam. And while people like Rodin in the 20th century, 1910, are still trying to hang on to that tradition and keep it alive, are faced with this. 1917, Marcel Duchamp buys a urinal in a hardware store or in a plumbing store, puts it on his back, signs it with a fictitious name, dates it, and calls it art, the ready-made, repurposed for the sake of the art gallery for all to behold and mill around and see it with all these other works. And while it is in itself obviously not figurative, so it becomes absurd to compare it to other works of art that are figurative, we can see a little bit of what Marcel Duchamp is up to. Destruction is also creation, is something that he said. So he's in the business of tearing down the old for the sake of building up the new. And C.S. Lewis says of this abolition of man that those who are in the business of abolishing man, those who will replace traditional values are not men in the old sense at all. They are, if you like, men who have sacrificed their own share of traditional humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. So people like Marcel Duchamp and other artists that we'll see that are actually figurative, and he did do some figurative work as well, are in the business of redefining man and his very nature. And the power of man to make himself what he pleases means actually the power of some men to make other men what they please. So there's a domination happening there, the power of some over many. It's a tyranny. And he also says that he's inclined to think that these conditioners, that he also terms man molders, the people that are refashioning humanity, will hate the conditioned. And we'll see a few examples of this. So 20th century sculpture by Moore that distorts and contorts and pulls apart the figure is not showing that value, that intrinsic value and that dignity to which we are supposed to have this response of love, but rather shows us something bizarre and grotesque, which is not the subject of love. It doesn't exude the same profound humanity that the works of Michelangelo do. And so even if you think that it's unfair to compare some of these modern sculptures to a Renaissance sculpture like Michelangelo, I propose that we compare an artist to himself. So here's an artist who in the late 19th century was working like this, a beautiful portrait showing the interior life of this man, the dignity of the common laborer here depicted. And you'll see in a minute who this is. So he's starting to get more abstract. This is a work that I think still shows a great deal of humanity. So this is not a war against abstraction that I'm waging here. I think that these works actually still show a dimension of personhood. This is, of course, Picasso. But then look what happens. He ruins the figure. He distorts and destroys and has a great deal of contempt for the figure that's obvious here. And when we look at some of his early work, this portrait of his mother that he painted when he was a young man, versus this actual portrait right here, this is not just some random figurative abstraction. This is a portrait of an actual person, or is supposed to be Lee Miller, that there's nothing of that profound love and respect that we're talking about is the proper response to the person visible there. And when we turn to 20th century artists, we see this all over the place. The big names, de Kooning, Francis Bacon, Francisco Clemente, and Pollock, before he was doing this, was actually also doing figurative work. Here's one of his pieces, The Orange Face. And it is really, I think, a grotesque, and I think I would agree with C.S. Lewis that it is a work that is rooted in a hatred or contempt for the person rather than love for the person. So in these final stages, he says, or the final stage will actually be here, he says, when man by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, by propaganda and so on, has obtained full control over himself to determine exactly what it is. These are things that are happening right now, tampering with the making of persons. John Paul II cautions us against this, saying abortion, euthanasia, and human cloning, which is not upon us just yet, but there's always some psycho trying to advocate for that. For example, reducing the human person to a mere object, life and death at order, as it were, an object amongst many that is no better, no more valuable than a chair or a pear or a dog or anything else. And Andy Warhol picks up on this. There's nothing particularly special about the individual person. There's nothing unique or dignified about them. They are simply an infinitely repeatable commodity up for sale. And any star that has branded themselves and turned themselves into a thing for buying and selling and made millions has sacrificed something, to use C.S. Lewis' words, of their own humanity for the sake of gaining power, which they have in abundance, and can make people try to act like them and try to be like them and try to, and they get infinite respect for the amount of wealth that they have and the power that comes with that and so on. And we'll take a moment just to look at what happens with architecture, which once was this beautifully human expression, this figurative art form. The Bauhaus turns utility into the norm and the measure of all things, instead of man, the measure of all things. And these brutalist sculptures, which are buildings which exist all over the place, you have many of them right here in D.C., are hideous. Health and Human Services, D.C. You might go in healthy, but I think you'll come out dead or something. This, another brutalist structure here, is actually a church in Nevers, France, St. Bernadette. And if you think this is just some elitist thing, like, oh, some weird modernists are commissioning strange buildings, just look at what's happening on Main Street. Utility dominates everything. And the places that we live start to look like this. And Le Corbusier, who's another one of these huge influential modernist architects, said a house is a machine for living. So everything's becoming mechanized. Even the people that work on the factory line are just another cog in the wheel, pieces of the machinery of the fabric of society, completely dehumanized culture. Here are some of his churches. Ronchamp is one that we all know, the backside of which looks like this. Here, another one of his churches, which from the inside, instead of this glorious and beautiful humanizing experience, looks more like a nuclear reactor or something. The Joseph Pieper's dome of the workaday world comes to mind, this impenetrable concrete dome that oppresses us, that we can't break through and transcend from. So that's no church in an objective sense. That's something pressing down upon you instead of allowing you to transcend upward towards the divine. So here's St. Bernadette again. And here, by contrast, is this architecture of exuberant joy and beauty that brings us into a deep sense of contemplation of these mysteries at hand, is certainly not present in places like this. The Rothko Chapel, so the guy with the red painting that had 2 shades of red in it, did this chapel. And instead of telling you anything about humanities, this idea that the Catholic churches are educating us as to what our nature is, what our relationship with God is, what our eternal destiny is, and so on and so forth. And it's all written there in stone. Here we have nothing, and people contemplating nothing. And we've grown so suspicious of telling anybody about who they are or who they might be that we say, here, sit, you got your blank slate, you're the tabula rasa, you figure it out, determine for yourself, turn yourself into whatever it is that you want to be. So even architecture is stripped of its humanity, and C.S. Lewis says that each generation exercises power over its successors. This makes sense, right? We are changing things as we go, and there will be a repercussion for this throughout the ages. But he also says that each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it, rebels against tradition and resists and limits its power. over its predecessors. So the limitation is going in both directions, trying to have power over future generations, but also limit the power of previous generations, and no longer transmits what it means to be human. And when I was putting this together and I added this quote in, I was remembering these videos that I just saw last week about ISIS with sledgehammers breaking these statues and all these museums. I don't know if anyone else saw this. Just completely devastating these museums with thousands of year old sculptures in there, because they're trying to destroy and limit the power that those works of art have over them, and refashion those cultures again from scratch to something horrific, right? It's a barbaric act. So again, just to point out that this isn't something that's just happening in new construction. But if we look at this painting, one of these beautiful paintings showing Christ in glory, surrounded by angels, the communion of saints, these pillars of the church, or these living stones here encased within the architecture of the New Jerusalem. This is a painting that was here at the Josephinum in Columbus, Ohio. And after the Second Vatican Council, at some point, they took some garage floor paint and painted over it and got rid of the whole thing and mutilated this church. This is St. Mary's in Kansas City, the oldest church in the diocese, which also had a beautiful high altar, and artwork there was all torn out. They placed here instead a giant speaker, put paneling, broke open the wall at the bottom 10 feet, and pushed the altar back into this little cave. And I showed this to an architect friend of mine who's not even Catholic, and they said, "That's incredible, it looks like a guillotine." And I said, "You don't know how right you are. That's the head of Christ there at the apse that was mutilated and cut off. And there you're left with this blank, oppressing, brown, dark wall that comes bearing down on you instead of lifting you up." And it doesn't end there. When churches like this are being built new from scratch, it looks like an innocent enough place. It's just a building. It's not so offensive. But if we start to look around, we see again this idea of utility being at the foremost, the air ducts, the can lighting, and so on, the unadorned structural members, the drop ceiling paneling, the acoustic tile, all this stuff that has merely utilitarian value is placed in these extremely prominent places here, and nothing else is around. This is a Catholic church, and the back wall here empty and void, with nothing but a few speakers and some can lights and some fake plants. So this is an overall devastating cultural setting that we are living in right now. But not all is lost. You know, there are still some of us that are attempting to keep this alive. That's one of the things that this show is about. It is a figurative art show. It is filled with artists who maybe wouldn't say verbatim the things that I have said, but they would certainly say that they're attempting to rebuild and keep alive and connect with the tradition and work to inspire and so on. And this isn't just limited to the artists here. There are actually many architects coming about working in the classical tradition, and many trying to reinterpret the classical tradition and implement it in new ways. And this is also happening in secular culture, a huge movement towards classical figuration that's been resurging over the last 20 years or so. And hopefully, as the years progress here, we'll be making a greater and greater and greater mark. So with that, I wanted to conclude here tonight. The relevance, I think, of this show, or the reason why we should care about whether figurative art is being made, is because it is about us. It says profound things about us as human beings, and it teaches us ultimately who we are, and there's much that we can learn from it in general, and in particular with some of the works that you see here as well. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.